Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. So this is the Liverpool Dementia and Ageing Research Forum. Once again, we're going to be running the session virtually online, which fortunately means that we've been able to open this up to a lot of attendees. So we've got lots of people attending both nationally and internationally. We've actually had over 360 people register to attend the session today, so hopefully we're going to have an excellent turnout. So if you attended the last forum, you'll know how it's run, but for any new attendees, I'll just kind of recap. Your mics and cameras will be switched off and you'll only be able to see and hear our presenters today. We do welcome all of your questions and comments, so you should be able to see a Q&A comment box down the side of the screen, and if you would like to share your comments and your questions as we go along, and at the end of the two presentations we'll do a short Q&A session. So we've got two presenters today who are going to be sharing their experiences and their research. The first with Clarissa Giebel, who is a research fellow at the University of Liverpool, and she's going to be sharing her research on the COVID-19 impact on dementia care. Afterwards, we're going to hear from Steve Callahan, who is a full-time carer for his mum living with dementia, and he's going to share his views on his experiences of caring for his mum during the pandemic. Okay, so I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Clarissa Giebel, if she would like to give us our talk on COVID-19 and dementia care.
Okay, thank you, Kerry. I'm just going to share my slides now. Here we go. Hope you can see this all. So yeah, as Kerry just introduced me, I'm a research fellow at the University of Liverpool and the NIHR ARC Northwest Coast, and today I'll be sharing some of our emerging findings on our COVID-19 dementia and aging study with you. I know that we have some international guests as well, so just a little bit about the background in terms of dementia care in the UK and what services are being provided. So there are well over 850,000 people currently living with dementia. This is estimated to reach over 1 million by 2025. And unpaid carers, so that's family members and friends, they're really often neglected in terms of how much support they provide to their loved ones with dementia. So it's estimated that approximately they provide £13 billion worth of care each year. But in addition to having an unpaid carer, not everyone with dementia does have an unpaid carer. People can access services in the community. So, for example, social activities such as singing and dancing groups or peer support groups, daycare centres, respite care, but also having paid carers coming into the home and doing additional care. Okay. Oh yes, and these are provided often by third sector organisations or by the social care system. Okay. So, because we have a few people from abroad joining us, just a bit of a background, because we know that the public health restrictions have been different in each country. So in the UK, on the 23rd of March, we had a nationwide lockdown for over 3 months. And even before that, a couple of days before that, vulnerable people and those aged 70 and over were told to shield, so not to go out and not to go to the supermarket, for example, until early August. And what nationwide lockdown meant for us was that we were not supposed to go outside unless we were to go for exercise once a day, or we had to go to the supermarket and buy some food, or to the pharmacy, for example. But really, we were supposed to stay at home. And obviously, we have the social distancing rules and face masks. And since late June, these restrictions have kind of eased, and cafes and shops have reopened in early July as well. But now we have local lockdowns or local variation in terms of how many people we're allowed to see, or whether we have a bubble, or how many different households we're allowed to engage with. So we thought early on that, considering that now we're not supposed to see people face to face anymore, everyone's supposed to stay on their own in their home, that surely must have a huge impact on the lives of people living with dementia and unpaid carers in terms of accessing support services. So we did a two-part study, a qualitative and a quantitative approach, looking at how people have been affected. So mostly I'll be talking now about the qualitative work that we have done and some of the emerging findings from our baseline interviews. So back in April, we've done over the phone 50 qualitative interviews. So we've interviewed 42 carers and 8 people living with dementia. And we recruited participants via social media, via a lot of third sector organizations and social support organizations, such as the Liverpool House of Memories or Tide Carers, the Brain Charity, and we worked with the Alzheimer's Society as well, to really get the word out and try and reach as many people across the UK as possible. And afterwards, so we had about three to 4 months after, we contacted a number of people, and about 20 people were followed up in the interviews, so 16 carers and 4 people with dementia. So that was late June, early July. And what we wanted to understand was really how have the public health restrictions impacted on accessing social support services, on accessing paid care, for example, and how did it make people feel? But then also to see how have services adapted in that period of time, so compared to back in April when we did the follow-up interviews. So I'm going to talk about a couple of quite large themes that emerged already back in April. I think one of the most important and biggest theme that came out was people appear to deteriorate so much faster. So it was only in April, the lockdown had only taken place 23rd of March, but already carers were saying, oh, I feel like my relative, my dad here, 5 weeks ago, my dad was a totally different person than he is now, and he won't come back from this. So people were already noticing the faster cognitive deterioration, but also physical deterioration, because the person with dementia was supposed to stay at home, not engage socially, not get that cognitive stimulation, and not see the peers or friends that they used to see before. But also, many people usually would go for a walk or to just be active outside, whereas now they were stuck to the home. They wouldn't move much, but just really stay at home. So we already found back then that it had an impact on their dementia symptoms and their physical symptoms. Another thing that came out was uncertainty. So these are all different female carers. We had a lot of daughters that took part, by the way. And the theme of uncertainty was really people were worried what's going to happen in a few months down the line. Will the person with dementia still access the services? How will those services look like? Will they be just remote or face-to-face? How many people will be able to access them at any given time? And they were really concerned because of that faster deterioration that the person with dementia wouldn't be able to access the services anymore because they'd be maybe not recognizing their peers anymore. Another thing that emerged already was adapting to the new normal. So in April, we found that very, very few services were providing any form of remote support. And the remote support was mostly via video conferencing, so Zoom or Microsoft Teams, sometimes WhatsApp as well. But because of different subtypes in dementia, for example, PCA, some people with dementia have vision issues. So if you imagine you're looking at a screen, and usually you are at a support group setting where you see your friends and your peers, but then you're just looking at the screen and you can't really recognize who you're talking to. But then there's also the issue that not everyone has access to technology and not everyone might understand how to set it up in the first place. So if we consider that there's only going to be remote support, that will leave out a large proportion of people in getting any type of support. And that already emerged in April. Another interesting area of care that we found, we've published the findings now in last week, was looking at paid home care and how unpaid carers make that decision as to whether they would like to continue receiving paid home care or not. So on the picture on the left side, it was pre-pandemic times. You see that the carer is almost hugging the lady, and there's no worry in terms of how close you are to someone, wearing a face mask, for example. That was the norm. Whereas now, on the right side, you see this elderly gentleman, you see the care worker, she's wearing a face mask, a visor, apron, gloves, and obviously she has to be a bit closer because she's providing a personal care task. But there's now all these different rules that people have to adhere to when providing paid home care. So we looked at how unpaid carers make those decisions. Do they decide to continue home care, or do they decide, no, I'd like to discontinue? So there were quite a few unpaid carers, so family members, friends, who decided, I'm too afraid that this home care paid carer will bring in the virus and transmit this virus to the person with dementia, because we don't know how many clients they see on a regular basis, whether they adhere to public health restrictions themselves outside of working hours. They might pick it up on their public transport to work, for example. So quite a few carers decided, no, we do no longer want to have paid carers coming in. As a result of that, there were quite a few people who had that increased level of burden because they had to take on additional caring duties. They might have been burdened in the first place and the paid carers were offering some relief, but now there was no respite from that, so they were taking on the additional caring duties. Some carers decided, no, we're going to continue having staff coming in because we just can't cope otherwise. Whereas others were thinking, well, we do decide that paid carers should come in, but there were quite a few issues in terms of financial support. So some family members received financial support from the local council to have paid carers come in. And they were worried that if they were now saying, no, I'm fine, I want to manage this by myself, and then in a few months down the line, they say, I would like to receive paid care again, that the council would say, no, you've managed by yourself, now we're not going to support you financially, you have to cope by yourself. So although they didn't want to have anyone come in, they decided it's the only way. And for those people that did decide to continue paid care as well, what was really interesting to see was that there was such a huge variation in terms of how paid carers were using PPE, so personal protective equipment. Some carers were not using anything. Some were wearing face masks, some were wearing gloves. So we had one family carer as well. She actually complained to the paid carer directly and said, I am not having you come back in unless you're wearing the full PPE. I'm too afraid about it. And I'm sharing a couple of quotes illustrating these cases. So again, we had a daughter and she was saying she just couldn't cope by herself. And she was really grateful to those paid carers continuing to come in. She wasn't sure what else to do if they hadn't done that. So clearly they was really grateful. And then here's that issue in terms of financial support again. As she was saying, I'm quite fearful that will be the case for us. So the council will stop financial support. So just a couple of quotes to illustrate what I was just talking about. And then late June, early July, we did 20 follow-up interviews with carers and people with dementia. So we're still analysing the data and writing it up fully, but kind of to illustrate again what care is like, what has been like. So pre-pandemic, yeah, no social distancing, everyone could get together in a support group, for example, or daycare centre. Whereas now on the right side here, that's the COVID new normal. So there's actually a slide of us, of our team meeting. That's the norm now for support groups to meet as well remotely, via Zoom, for example. But then also in care homes, we hear a lot of stories that if residents are seeing their family members, it is often through a window, for example, or maybe outside, socially distanced, if they see them at all. So what we found in those 3 months since or 4 months since the lockdown was that very few services have actually adjusted, both community-wise, but also we spoke to a few carers whose residents were living in a care home, whose people with dementia were living in a care home. And there didn't seem to be any coherent level of support or guidance. So some were receiving remote support, but many people were saying it's just not the same. And actually many people felt more depressed because of it, because they were missing the face-to-face support so much. Okay, so just some brief overview of what we're still analysing at the moment. And as I mentioned before, we've also done a quantitative survey. So we've done this online and over the phone. And we wanted to understand how older adults, carers and people with dementia have experienced the changes in social support provision since the lockdown. So we started mid-April. And it's really important to note that we included current carers as well as former carers, because former carers are often neglected, but they still access, in many instances, support groups, for example, or further support, because just because they've stopped caring doesn't mean they stop needing any form of support. So we did this again in collaboration with lots of our organizations. So, for example, House of Memories, Tide Carers, and we did this nationwide. So we had about 94% who completed the survey online, but we wanted to make sure that we also include people who might be a little bit more, who are not attached to the internet, so they don't have access to that. They might be a bit more isolated, actually. And it was really important to capture these people as well. So at time point 1, over 660 people took part in our survey, and that was at the height of lockdown restrictions. So 5 to 6 weeks later, at time point 2, we had over 480 people who completed the survey again. And then at time point 3, when restrictions were already quite eased, over 400 people completed the survey. So we've got a full data set of over 400 people. And specifically, we asked them at each time point, what type of social support services are you currently accessing? And at time point 1, we asked them, what have you accessed pre-pandemic, in a normal week before the pandemic? So we asked them in detail about, have you accessed paid home care, daycare centres, respite care, all these things, and how many weekly hours of care you've received. We also asked participants at each time point about their mental well-being, so their quality of life, their levels of depression, levels of anxiety, whether they were resilient. And we also measured carer burden. So on the next slide, you can see, so we had on the baseline survey, so at time point 1, we had complete data of 569 participants. So we just had to exclude a few participants because they didn't complete all the questions. And what you can see here, just a bit of a snapshot because we're still finalizing all the analysis, is for people living with dementia on the left side, and for current carers on the right side. You see how the proportion of people who have access to the different types of services before the pandemic and then at the baseline. So as you can see here, all of these services are reducing. In grey, you see it pre-pandemic times, and then in black, you see how it was at baseline, so mid-April to mid-May. You can really see all these services are reducing, and people have received quite a few things before. Particularly, they've accessed support groups and social activities. But what's interesting is that people are still accessing quite a few paid carers. So kind of reflecting on our qualitative findings that accessing paid home care hasn't been affected that much in terms of utilization. People were still accessing it. So some of the implications so far, we're still analysing our data. We've got a lot of qualitative and quantitative data to look through. But what emerges so far already is that remote support is just not the same. And many people don't even access any remote support because services haven't adjusted to it. Also in terms of care homes, the few people we spoke to. And what people were really saying was, because it's not the same and it doesn't give them the same benefits and quality of life, they were so keen on having face-to-face support again, but obviously being really wary of virus transmission. So if there were face-to-face support coming up again, there needs to be so much care taken in terms of socially distancing and obviously having everything safe and secure for people to access if they want to access that. And generally, in terms of paid care as well, paid home care, family carers and people with dementia need to be better supported to making those decisions. Would they like to continue receiving support or not? And what are the benefits? What are the downsides? So really what our findings show so far is it's a huge issue. Social care has been a huge issue before the pandemic, but this has created even more issues now, the pandemic. Okay. And so this is our UK study, and luckily we've been linking up with Australia, Poland, India and Italy as well to understand the experiences and the impacts of public health restrictions on dementia care more widely. So Australia and Poland have been really busy already. They've got the survey up and running. They've interviewed quite a few carers and people with dementia already as well. India's done quite a few interviews already, and Italy is starting very soon. And what Australia and Poland have already identified were kind of similar themes to what we've come up in our qualitative study. So in the next couple of months, we'll comparing these experiences internationally as much as possible, given there's different restrictions in place everywhere. And in terms of international impacts as well and international understandings, we are also working together with the ARCAT in Uganda and Dr. Isaac Dumba. And what we wanted to understand, now this study the data collection is completed, we're just finishing the analysis, is really what is the impact of COVID public health restrictions on older adults in Uganda? Most likely incredibly different to how we are being affected by those restrictions, how older adults or people with dementia are affected in the UK by the restrictions. So a little bit of a background on Uganda and the older adult population. About 2.7% are age 60 plus. Now, in low and middle income countries, it's often age 60 and above where people are classed as older adults. And in Uganda, they're amongst the poorest of society. So they often have to rely on their children or grandchildren for food, for income, and they generally have poor access to basic food and water and healthcare. So that was the situation before the pandemic as well. Now imagine, put those COVID public health restrictions on top of that. Surely there must be huge impacts on their lives. So just finishing analysing it, but a little bit of a snapshot on just how much people have been affected. And I must say it was quite emotional reading through those transcripts. So what we've done is our collaborators in Uganda have done 30 telephone interviews with older adults, asking them about their experiences of how these different public health measures have affected their lives. And what came out really that it's really affected their basic survival in some instances. So they don't have an income anymore because many of them can't reach the farmland that they used to grow food on. Or they don't have people coming by anymore and buying their produce. So lack of income results in them not being able to buy any food unless they're growing it. And also they can't afford to send their grandchildren to school. So if there's the decision being made between, do we have some food for today or sending our grandkids to school, it will be the food. But this also has an impact on their healthcare, because they can't travel on, or they, at the point where we did the interviews, they couldn't travel on public transport because of restrictions. So they couldn't reach their local hospital or the doctor, and they were struggling to get any medication, if anything, or anything more than medication, really. But what was also interesting was that in Uganda there was a 7 p.m. curfew. So, and if people weren't adhering to this curfew, there was a lot of violence to reinforce that. So people stayed at home. So many people don't even seek out, for example, hospital treatment or accessing food that's a bit further away, because of the worry of being beaten, although all they need really is those basic necessities. Okay, so really comparing that already to the UK findings, it's a completely different picture, really impacting on their lives. And just so that was just a bit of an overview of our Uganda study and our UK study, and more will emerge as we go along. But really to say an incredibly big thank you to all those participants for both of our study arms. And our study team actually comprises quite a few carers and a person living with dementia, to make sure that our research makes sense and is relevant to what's happening and important. And just a big thank you to the many organisations who are part of our team as well. So we've got lots of third sector organisations and clinical team members and fellow academics. So thank you very much.
Okay, Clarissa, thank you very much for giving us that lovely talk. We're going to hand over now to Steve, and I'd just like to remind everybody that we are still taking some questions and comments so that we can add these to the Q&A session afterwards. So if you would like to publish some more comments and questions, we can collate those all at the end. Okay. So Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and a big thank you really to Kerry and Clarissa for inviting me to speak, and for Anne for sorting it all out. I just sort of realised really after listening to Clarissa's talk, my story isn't unique, but it's just a reflection really of what a lot of people went through. The reason for showing you a picture of my mum and me is for you to have sympathy for me mum for having to look at my face for 3 months. So can I have the next slide, Clarissa?
Yeah.
Okay, so just a wee bit of background really from sort of my mum's perspective. So she had symptoms of cognitive impairment since 2009, but wasn't formally diagnosed with Alzheimer's until 2012. Mum's been living with myself and my wife since 2015, and as expected, the normal sort of trend of Alzheimer's, she's had a slow and steady deterioration during that time. And we've responded to that deterioration with increased support for her, but also for me. And she's probably at the stage of moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease at the moment. Okay, next. So just to give you a sort of a typical week really for me mum, sort of pre-COVID, there was interest for her socially and etc. for most afternoons. So my sister would be there really for on a Monday. I would have a paid carer for some music therapy and singing and chatting etc. on a sort of Tuesday. She would visit my other sisters on a Wednesday. Mainly Thursday she was at home all day with me, but we would go out to the shops, and that was becoming less because of my mum's behaviour. On a Friday she went to a dementia day centre called the Meter Youth Centre in Liverpool. Another visit on a Saturday at my sister's, and mainly sort of home with me all day on a Sunday, and then we'd actually sort of go to church then as well. Okay, next slide. So pre-lockdown, I decided as we were watching the news, and every 3 days the rates of infection were doubling. 2 weeks pre-lockdown, I decided to stop going to the Meet You Day Centre. It's a very popular centre, lots and lots of people there. So I stopped that, and we also stopped going to church as well. And then the week before lockdown in March, my mother-in-law was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer, and my sort of work with infectious disease consultants in HIV was put on hold because obviously they turned their attention to sort of COVID. Okay, next. So just to sort of give you a bit of a chronological order really of what sort of happened during lockdown. So we went from obviously very busy afternoons to no routine for mum, no social interaction, no different people, no activities to look forward to, and also zero support for me, should I say. One of my sisters needed 2 forms of public transport, bus and train, to actually get to me, and we decided that wasn't sort of appropriate at the time really. At the same time, my wife moved out into a parents' house to care for her mum, and so from morning till night, I had 3 questions: who's Boris, what's coronavirus, and when do I go home, really? And that was sort of a constant sort of theme, really. But what I started to notice was that mum was getting up in the night more frequently, and therefore she was more sleepy during the day, and it was very difficult to try and break that cycle. I tried all sorts of different things but couldn't break the cycle. Next. So on the 3rd week of lockdown, my mother-in-law died, and that's when I'm quite a horizontal, sort of laid back type of person, and don't really get sort of stressed that often. But I did start to feel quite stressed, not just sort of because I was tired and the constant repeating of the same questions, but more importantly, I was unable to support my wife as I would normally, and most other people would do under normal circumstances. And for me, that was sort of quite hard. But from my mum's perspective during that time, and this is actually links to one of the carers in Clarissa's study really, my mum sort of round about sort of week 4, 5 and 6 really, she appeared more confused, she was more tired during the day, having difficulty recalling the names of objects, regular now frequently night wakening, and actually reluctant to do any sort of exercise, either sort of chair based or dancing as she would normally do in the Meet You Dementia Centre. Okay, next slide, thank you. So during the week 6 to 12, mum was a very different person from the start of the year. She you know, had real difficulty in recognising who I am. Her sleep pattern is now completely different. She although it's stopped now, she was having visual hallucinations, and a short-term and long-term memory is much worse, and less interest in activities such as knitting, and then getting sort of quite confused and not recognising objects as well, such as food items or what the toilet is, or soap, a bar of soap, not recognising what it actually is really. And I also noticed an increase in frailty. So mum has quite severe osteoarthritis in her knees, and that seemed much worse. And I think the lack of movement, or even just sort of walking to the car, getting into the car, going out shopping or something like that, really, she has lost muscle tone and strength, and therefore that's affected her balance. So now, even within the house, she tends to link me, where we didn't do that before, really. So for me, the question was, is this a rapid decline normal for her stage of the disease? Is she entering a new phase? Is it the impact of lockdown, or is it both? Okay, next slide. So I love this quote actually, and I think about this quote when I'm talking about designing dementia. So when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And so that's what was in the back of my mind when I decided to change a few things. Okay, next slide. So for me, I think I needed a wee bit of focus. My work had stopped. I was just trying to encourage my mum and to do different things with little success. So I threw myself into a bit of DIY in the house. I also arranged for one of my sisters to have some, well, we arranged transport from another family member so she could visit at least one day a week. And the dementia unit that mum goes to had closed down and the staff had been furloughed. So I arranged for one of the Me2You staff to come as a paid carer for just one afternoon, just for 3 hours. And although that was a lot less normal for me, it felt absolutely great to have that support, and for mum, but also a bit of social interaction for me. And mum became very engaged with the care. I could see there was a change in her and a lift, really, and probably very happy to see another face, really. She sort of come alive at that time, really. Next slide. So post lockdown, really, our afternoon routines are now back to normal, but we now have a situation where night wakening is a constant feature, and it can be 8, 9, 10 times during the night now. Her frailty and dementia deterioration that she's experienced has not reversed. She has a lack of interest in most things. She's tired all the time, and she recognises me and my family less often. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for that very powerful and impactful presentation. It was lovely to hear your experiences as well. So we've now got our Q&A session, and we've had a few comments and questions published throughout. Clarissa and Steve, I'm not sure if you can see the questions, but I can certainly read them out and we can go through a few of these. So the initial ones I think are more directed to Clarissa. Firstly, we have Jacqueline asking if this is going to be recorded and will the slides be shared with participants later on. So yes, it is currently being recorded and we can share these slides later. Thank you. The next question then is from Tim, saying, thinking for best interest in decision making, what evidence did you see of involving the person with dementia in deciding on whether or not paid home care visits were going to be possible?
Well, it was we had transcripts from 15 unpaid carers who had experiences of making those decisions in terms of continuing or not continuing paid home care, and there were, I think in most instances it was mostly just the unpaid carer who made that decisions, but there were a few instances where people were saying we all sat down as a family together and decided what do we do now. So not only the carer, not only the person living with dementia, but also their spouses, their children, because in many instances the person with dementia was living with them as well. So it was then making that joint family decision, what do we do? Are we too afraid or do we risk it? So yeah, in some instances there were involved.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, the next question then is from Carolyn, saying, what do we know about how care homes have maintained activities with residents? I'm worried that some residents have been living in their room for 6 months and have not left their room.
So just to state from the outset, our study was not necessarily looking specifically at the care home situation, but particularly doing those follow-up interviews. And during that time, a couple of the unpaid carers, their loved ones with dementia had entered a care home. So through that pandemic, so then we also had additional experiences of what it's like as a family member to visit or not visit the person with dementia in the care home. And we didn't specifically look at how active they were, although that's a really important issue because we see in the news that, well, it looks like people are just in their rooms, they don't get that stimulation. I mean, even from doing this more community-based study, we do find that people staying in their own home themselves, that already leads to cognitive and physical deteriorations. But so mainly what we can say from our work is that there's very limited remote interaction between family carers and residents, and very, very limited face-to-face. And if face-to-face, then it's mostly through a window, for example.
Yeah, definitely, thank you. Okay, our next question is from Helen saying, were you able to analyse how many persons with dementia were able to understand why they could not have family visits?
So I suppose I'm just trying to think how to respond to that, because most of the people we interviewed were unpaid carers. And the people living with dementia that did take part in our research, they had capacity to consent. So that means they understood all those restrictions. Now, in terms of where we spoke to carers, we've what's the word for it? We saw that there were a lot of people with dementia who just didn't understand those restrictions in particular, and we're just looking at that in detail actually now at the moment. And for example, there was one particular incident which was really worrisome, to have those restrictions, but then people with dementia not comprehending them. So the daughter was usually now always doing the shopping for her mother with dementia, because the person with dementia shouldn't go into the supermarket. But then the daughter comes the next day and her mother says, oh, I've just been down to the Morrison's or something. And it didn't make sense having all these little arrows on the floor. So clearly people with dementia not understanding those restrictions can be dangerous to them, because they don't use face masks, for example. They don't understand why they shouldn't be out, some of them.
Yes, good point.
Maybe Steve, do you have some insight into that from how your mother is experiencing this?
Well, I'd sort of stopped taking my mum out and about before COVID, really, because she used to be a children's nurse. So we're in the supermarket, and if she spotted anybody under the age of 10, she would make a beeline for them and want to hug them and chat to them and talk to them and ask them questions and stuff like that, really. And you know, some people got quite frightened about that, really, under normal circumstances. So under COVID restrictions, my mum just did not understand distance, and you know, even when we did go out for a drive, perhaps then she'd be asking why people are wearing masks, etc., really. So I didn't sort of really experience the shopping element of things, really, you know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We have another question from Robbie saying, have you found that there is a further disproportionate impact on those from BAME communities living with dementia and the impact of COVID?
So that's interesting. So for both of our qualitative and our study and our survey, we did actively approach groups, BAME dementia specific groups, and they were all, the organisers were very keen to help spread the word of this, but unfortunately we didn't have that great of an uptake of people from BAME backgrounds taking part in our research. So there's definitely an overrepresentation of white ethnic carers and people with dementia and older adults. So we can't generalize those findings to the whole population as such, and there needs to be much more focus on how people are experiencing it from a BAME background. Yes.
Thank you. We have a comment from Julie, more sharing her experience really as well, which kind of seems to centre around the decision-making process and deciding what was best for her mum during the time of COVID. And I think there is a good question in there about the decision-making process and what information is being offered to people. Perhaps Steve, maybe you could share some insight as to what kind of information you had or what guidance you had during this period in making decisions with your mum.
It was mainly internal decisions that I made, really, sort of based on so what I was hearing from the news, really. I had no contact. Well, it was actually six weeks into lockdown, I received a call from the sort of carer services from Sefton to say, was I okay getting shopping? That's all they sort of seemed to be interested 6 weeks into COVID, really. So that wasn't much help. I had no support from memory clinic, etc., really. So it was just, I suppose, I mean, I am a nurse by background, so it was, you know, I suppose I was using my own sort of balance really, and my own sort of risk versus benefits understanding and able to read and write, you know, because there are people there who, you know, have, you know, sort of, you know, problems with literacy and you know, being able to make sense of the world anyway. So I suppose I just sort of, I suppose, use the internet and news outlets and stuff like that really, you know. Yeah, I suppose, you know, sorry, a point I wanted to touch on before from Helen's one, about Helen's point before about you know, was my mum able to understand whether she could have a family visit? I think my mum's at the stage she doesn't really, she's unaware of what day it is and whether someone was coming or not really. So that was just sorry to finish my answer off from before really.
I think I think one thing to really highlight here again is we were kind of aware of this pre-pandemic, but now even more so, that people living with dementia who have a family carer or a friend carer, they're in so much of a better position because in terms of accessing care as well, if there is care available or support services, because the carers can then look on the internet or talk to peers, talk to other carers, talk to family members and find out that information, whereas there's a huge number of people with dementia that are living by themselves. They don't have an unpaid carer, so they're left without having that information of how to access care in many instances.
Yeah, and particularly if English is not the first language as well, really, to link to the BAME question, really, the BAME communities.
Yeah.
Yes, and following on from that, Jacqueline has also left some links there on different organisations that might be helpful for people sharing some information about the COVID-19 pandemic and dementia. And we have another question saying, did anything emerge from your work around potential safeguarding concerns?
So I suppose the example I just mentioned in terms of the person with dementia going to the supermarket without the family carer's knowledge and then coming back and just not comprehending that it's not that good at the moment to just go to the supermarket, and definitely not without a face mask and keeping socially distanced. So I wouldn't say it's it might be a safeguarding concern. It's just a danger to the person with dementia in some instances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we've got a few people thanking Steve for your story, which is lovely. And we've got a question for Steve from Paul saying, can I ask if you and your wife continue to work during this period? And if so, how did that affect your ability to care for your mother?
Okay, thanks, Paul. So, well, my wife was on the first few weeks. My wife was off caring for her mum, and then after week 3, she was on compassionate leave, and then she was sorting her dad out, and then she went back to work. So that was my wife really. But I under normal circumstances, I normally work from home anyway. So I'm an independent nurse, and I work from home, tend to do sort of projects, etc. Really, I just happen to be working in the field of HIV at the moment, and as I mentioned in my presentation, that stopped because the consultants were focused on COVID. So, you know, I had more time to spend with my mum. She probably would be unhappy with that really, but I normally sort of it didn't affect my ability to care at all really. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question or comment from Andy saying, is Steve's experience typical, and does deterioration in people's mental state affect their physical state? And I guess I could maybe direct that question to Clarissa, because I think that did come through some of the research findings.
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation as well, because of the lockdown and prolonged lockdowns, and our follow-up interviews, for example, now 20 follow-up interviews, we found that many people felt so upset and down about not being able to go out, not being able to see their peers and attend those previously enjoyed groups. So many of them actually stated themselves that they felt depressed. Quite a few of them, so people with dementia, but also carers, and there were huge emotional impacts on both. really. And I remember speaking to one person with dementia during those follow-up interviews, and he said he felt like in a prison, not being able to go out, and he was usually a very active participant in all those activities. And then at some point he was like, right, I'm going to go for a walk now, I can't stay indoors anymore. And he felt liberated, he said. It was really a big experience for him. So we really need to take account of the impacts of those restrictions on the mental well-being, on everyone, really.
Yes, good point. I've got a question from Catherine for Steve, saying, what advice would you give to carers in the event of another pandemic?
Okay, so I think this follows on really nicely from Clarissa's answer there, and I suppose for me it's risk versus benefit, or maybe more accurately the risk of catching COVID versus further deterioration, because that was what I was sort of thinking of really. So if a second lockdown occurs, I guess I wouldn't wait so long for support, because the impact on my mum was too great. So you know, I was fortunate for my mum, she doesn't have other comorbidities such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease really. So, you know, when I asked my sister and at a separate time a carer to come, I mean, they were sitting 4 meters away from me mum and behaved appropriately. They would come in, they would wash their hands, you know, and we actually looked at what the risks are versus the benefit for me mum. And so I think each case should be taken individually, and ask the question, the risk of catching COVID versus further deterioration. I would hate for another lockdown to occur, but I would certainly get somebody in and you know, and make sure that the sort of systems and processes in place really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have a few comments, people sharing their own experiences that resonate with Clarissa's findings and Steve's experiences. Julie's talking about connecting remotely with her mum and some of the confusion that's causing as well, which Clarissa has talked about with her theme of adaptations in her research. Sue has said she can't imagine how hard it has been for you to support your mum on your own throughout lockdown, and she's had a similar experience with her dad. Okay, we've got a question from Abid saying, for the sake of completeness, did you think of asking psychiatrists and clinical psychologists about how was their experience of dealing with behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia during the pandemic?
We did not talk to them as participants, but we do have a couple of psychiatrists and clinical psychologists involved as part of our study team, so quite a large team of us, not just from Liverpool, but really from different organisations. But in terms of picking out on those behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia, there were a few interviews where carers, unpaid carers, were noting how their relative with dementia started to get upset and maybe aggressive at some point and frustrated with those restrictions, because they just could not understand why they were suddenly not allowed to go outside anymore, not allowed to go to those support groups anymore, and then trying to explain this to the people with dementia. But then carers were stating that the next day they had to explain it again and again and again. So there was this huge level of frustration in many people with dementia.
Yeah. We have a question, well, more of a comment from Eve saying she's caring for mum at home but needs to return to work and often placed in a care home, won't be able to visit or settle mum in. Clarissa, I think you did have similar findings in your research about the decision of having entering a care home or letting somebody go into a care home, and the fears around the use of PPE and the confusion with not being allowed to go into the care home versus somebody with PPE being allowed to come into the home.
Yeah, I think most of our research was looking at receiving paid care in the own home. So in terms of care home, as I mentioned, we've only had a few carers that we spoke to, but definitely it's a huge concern if you don't know how, because each care home has different rules they adhere to, and sadly there's no like blanket policy guidance in terms of how care homes should provide care during the pandemic. There actually is some in the Netherlands which is being implemented more or less, but the UK is really lacking behind, so I suppose you don't really know what you get necessarily with each care home, which is a huge concern in itself.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've got a few more comments and experiences being shared as well. David has said, thank you for your insightful and informed presentation that mirrors my own experience as a carer for my mother. We also experienced disturbed sleep and reduced mobility, but find that singing groups were helpful, that were now run online by the Alzheimer's Wales and Forget Me Not Chorus. So it's something that, yes, I think again Clarissa talked about, some things could be put online, some services could adapt in that way, others couldn't.
Yeah.
Joe says, hi both, excellent talks, great to hear both of your experiences. I'm just wondering how COVID has impacted accessing healthcare services, for example, visiting the GP, hospital or getting medication. Steve mentioned an increase in frailty and deterioration. Would this be diagnosed by a GP?
Yeah, so in terms of our quantitative, in terms of our survey, we looked at visiting clinical settings both for mental health issues and for physical health issues, and we did notice a drop compared to pre-pandemic. But in terms of the medication, that's actually a really important issue that came out in some of the qualitative interviews as well. We noted that quite a few family carers had to sort out the blister packs for their person with dementia themselves. So the pharmacists, now that's not the case for everywhere, but a few carers noted that the pharmacist didn't want to touch the medication and then put it in the boxes, but instead it was the task was based on the carer then to sort that out. But we didn't, I suppose, yeah, most findings were coming from the survey about this.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
can I make a comment? Okay, so it's an interesting question actually about accessing healthcare services. I thought with, particularly for memory clinics, who would sort of cancel face-to-face appointments, they would have actually sort of contacted me. But that wasn't sort of the case, and so I had to be sort of proactive really, and sort of contact them mainly about, you know, for advice and support, and is there anything that we can do for my mum overnight. One of the things that I in regards to sort of being diagnosed by the GP, I think memory clinics put a lot of weight on the opinion and the advice and the guidance from carers in regards to the deterioration. So when people are at a certain stage of their disease, you know, the weighting of how's she been or how has he been is sort of taken really from the carers really. So this was about me feeding back to the memory clinic that I had to contact, and then ask for, you know, some advice and support really in regards to sort of night wakening, etc.
Thank you very much. So I think this is the end of the questions and comments that we've had shared, which is excellent timing because we're nearly at the end of the allotted hour for the session. So I think there's just a little bit of information we'd like to share before we finish about the next webinar.
Yeah, so our next webinar in November, on the 11th of November, from 1 till 2 p.m. again, we will hear from Dr. Stephen Mason from the University of Liverpool, and he will share some of his work on end-of-life care during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you will see the Eventbrite link on the slide in front of you, but I'm also posting it in the Q&A if you wish to register for the next event again.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the forum meeting today. So thank you so much, Clarissa and Steve, for sharing your talks on your experiences and your research findings of COVID-19 and dementia care during this time. It's very interesting, very impactful, and thank you very much for sharing them. And we hope to see everybody again then in November.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you for your nice comments. Thanks.